Hello and welcome to the Christ Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. This is Matthew Best. I serve as pastor of Christ Lutheran Church in Allison Hill in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Thanks for being here. If today's message connects with you and what you're going through, brings you inspiration, or offers connection with God, I ask you to please stay on after the message for just a few moments to learn ways to connect with the congregation and the health ministries that we offer. And now, let's dive into God's Word. Our reading comes from the book of Acts, chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and the tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every people under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each of them heard them speaking in the native tongue language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, all in our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Fellow Jews and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk as you supposed, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I want to tell you a little something strange that happened to me in a restaurant. This is a while back. Our family had spent a year living in Finland during seminary, which I can't believe it's been 11, 12 years at this point. All 6 of us. And while we were there, we heard a variety of languages everywhere. We heard Finnish, of course, which is very unique, difficult language. Also heard Swedish, Russian, German, French, Spanish, I don't know, a variety of other languages. And we got used to that. And after a while, hearing more than one language in a day just felt normal. And then we came home, and after a long day of travel, exhausted, we sat down in a restaurant, not really having any sense of where we were in the world. And Abby and I both noticed something at the same time. The table next to us. We heard them. I mean, we really heard them. And we looked at each other with wide eyes because they were speaking American English. And we had not heard American English, except for amongst our family, as the normal sound of daily life for about a year. And for a moment, we didn't know why it sounded so striking, so present, and so clear. And then we laughed because we realized we were back in the U.S. Of course, they were speaking American English. But our ears had changed. And we finally heard what we had stopped hearing before we left. I've been thinking about that moment all week as I sat with this text. The Feast of Pentecost is already ancient before we get to Acts 2. It's called Shavuot, which is what the Jewish people called Pentecost. It's one of the great pilgrimage feasts, 50 days after Passover, a harvest celebration giving thanks for the first fruits of the wheat. Luke tells us in verse 5 that devout Jews from every people under heaven had gathered in Jerusalem. Think about that. This is not some quiet religious gathering. This is an occupied city. Roman soldiers are posted at the gates. The empire has a keen interest in what happens when large crowds of Jews or anyone else gathers for festivals, especially festivals that remember liberation from slavery, that celebrate gifts that do not come from Caesar, but from God. These pilgrims had come from across the known world, across the Roman Empire, from Parthia and Media, Elam. These are all modern-day Iran and Iraq. From Egypt and Libya and North Africa, from Rome itself, over on the western end of the empire. They had crossed mountains and deserts and seas to be here, and they were not there to honor Rome. They were not there to celebrate Caesar. They were gathered to praise God, together, in their languages, carrying the stories and histories of their own people. That's already a quietly radical act. Rome saw itself as the great unifier, a divine order that had brought the world under one rule. Latin was the official language of the empire, and the language used the language of power and command and law. But the Spirit doesn't arrive speaking Latin and making official decrees. God's doing something different in this scenario. God is gathering the scattered, not to erase their differences, not to absorb them into one imperial image, but to meet each of them exactly as they are. And then there's the sound. Not wind, the sound of a rush of violent wind. There wasn't a storm. Nothing was destroyed. The curtains didn't blow. But the sound of it filled the entire house. And then what looks like tongues of fire appears above each of them, resting on them, not burning and not consuming, just present. I just want to stay with that for a moment because I think we rush past it really quickly. We don't know exactly what these things look like. We know they look like fire, according to the writing. We know the sound was like wind. Luke is reaching for language to describe something that went beyond the language that he had. The Spirit doesn't fit neatly into our categories. It never has. The Spirit was there at the very beginning, moving over the waters of creation. The Spirit rested on the judges and the prophets. The Spirit overwhelmed Ezekiel in the valley of dry bones, breathing life into that which was dead. The Spirit descended on Jesus at his baptism. Each time, the encounter is its own thing. Each time, it stretches our vocabulary for what God is doing. This is not the Spirit's first appearance. The Spirit is not new. This is new in this moment. And what is new in this moment is this gathering, this community of frightened and grieving and hopeful people who had watched their teacher be executed and then claimed that they had seen him alive. The Spirit comes to them in this moment in signs that are real but are not fully explainable. Signs that say, I'm here, pay attention. And here's what I keep returning to. The signs don't entirely make sense. Wind that isn't wind. Fire that doesn't burn. That's the point. The Spirit's presence doesn't submit to our frameworks of control. You can't manage it, regulate it, contain it. You can only notice it. And you can ask, what does this mean? And here's something important. The encounter with the Spirit is not something that the disciples went out and found. The Spirit came to them. That's how it's always worked. It's never about us getting to God. It's always about God coming to us. God coming to our humanity and our limitations, our confusion, our grief. God meeting us where we actually are, not where we think we should be, where we are. And the crowd speaks in languages, not in some private spiritual vocabulary that only insiders can understand, but in the languages of the people gathered there. Parthian, Mede, Elamite, Arabic, Egyptian, the languages people grew up in, the languages in which their mothers told them stories, the languages in which they dreamed. Learning a language is not a small thing. Anyone who's ever done it knows that when you learn a language, you don't just learn words and grammar rules. You learn what the people care about. You learn the jokes that don't translate. You learn the history that lives in certain words. You learn the food and the grief and the unique way those people see the world. Language and culture cannot be separated. To speak someone's language is to enter their world and not just their ears. This is what the Spirit does. The Spirit doesn't stand at a distance and send out a signal everyone has to figure out on their own. The Spirit moves towards each person, each story, each history, and speaks there. Good news is spoken in a language you understand is not the same as good news shouted at you from across a wall. One reaches you and the other doesn't. So what would it sound like to hear good news in a language that you might understand? For someone living in poverty, kind of poverty where you're counting what's left and figuring out how to make it to the end of the month, good news might sound like you have enough. Sounds like rent paid, food on the table, lights staying on. It doesn't sound like a lecture. It sounds like someone finally showing up with help. For someone who's been pushed out, told they don't belong, made to feel invisible, good news sounds like you're welcome here. Not barely tolerated. Welcome, fully, with no conditions attached. For someone struggling with addiction, good news sounds like there's a way through and people will walk it with you and you are not your worst moment. For someone who's been trafficked, good news sounds like you're not property. You've never been property. You are a human being made in the image of God. For someone who's come to this country to build a life and crossed the border, who worked the jobs that no one else would take, who raised children who know no other home, good news sounds like you belong here. You are seen. You will not be disappeared. For someone who's struggling with who they are, who they love, how they understand themselves before God, good news sounds like God made you and God doesn't make mistakes and you are beloved. For someone in pain, with a mouth that has hurt for a long time because there's no money, no access, good news sounds like someone is here, someone will help. The list goes on, it keeps going. And each one is different because the Spirit speaks in languages, real, specific languages. Not one general signal for everyone to sort out on their own. But there's something else here, something that might be harder to hear. There's also good news for the oppressor. And I know that on a week when the administration signed an executive order directing banks to screen customers for immigration status, on a week when more than 120,000 approved refugees remain stranded because the refugee program was frozen, on a week when the new policy tells immigrants seeking to become permanent residents that they need to leave the country and apply from outside, I know it's hard to talk about good news for the people designing those policies. Some of us are sitting with real anger right now. That's probably an understatement. Some of us have people who we love who are terrified. Some of us have neighbors who are afraid to leave their homes. And that anger is not wrong. It is, I would argue, the Spirit moving in you. And yet, the people using cruelty as a policy tool are also in bondage. The person who has built their identity around who they can exclude is living in a smaller and smaller world. The person who reaches for contempt and blame to feel powerful is not free. They are enslaved to it. They're carrying something heavy, and they may not even know it yet. Good news for the oppressor is this, that you can be set free from this. You don't have to live like this. The cage can be unlocked. I'm also a realist. They probably won't hear it that way. The ones with power rarely do. They will hear it as a threat. Then something that shakes the ground under them is something to push back against. Unfortunately, they believe the status quo is the good news. They don't see how the cruelty they're causing is also damaging them. They don't see how their need for control is itself a kind of suffering. And that, I think, is exactly what we're watching when we see the policies designed to make life harder for immigrants, for refugees, for the poor, for anyone who doesn't fit the preferred image of who belongs. There's always an excuse. There's always a reason. The goalposts are always moving. The ends always justify the means. This is the voice that's similar to what was said on Pentecost, that they are filled with new wine. Two responses. There's always two responses. The first, what does this mean? It's a genuine question, an open posture, confusion for certain, but confusion that's reaching toward understanding. These are people who know that something has happened and they know what it is and where it points, and they want to know what are they supposed to do now? The second response we heard in the reading, they're filled with new wine. Dismissal. An explanation that requires no further examination. Move along, nothing to see here. You know this dynamic. You live it every week. There's always going to be people who explain away God, who explain away justice, who explain away peace and mercy and the slow, stubborn movement of the Spirit toward the margins. There are always going to be people who, when confronted with something they can't control, reach for a story that protects what they already have. We hear it in policy language that calls cruelty a deterrent. We hear it in the insistence that complaints and accusations about immigrants are really just about law and order. We hear it sometimes even in church, in the statement, "Pastor, you're being too political." These statements are not invitations to a conversation. They're moves to stop the conversation. They are filled with new wine. They are the way of saying that I don't want to look at this. I don't want to ask whether my comfort and my beliefs are in tension with what Jesus actually taught. I want you to stop. But Peter doesn't stop. Standing in the middle of Pentecost, he quotes Joel. Why Joel? Because Joel addresses exactly this moment, the moment when people claim the Spirit is doing something unexpected, and the ones who want to explain it away try to do just that. Peter says that this is what the prophet spoke of. The Spirit poured out on all flesh, sons and daughters prophesying, old people dreaming, young people seeing visions, even on those whom the empire has decided don't count, the Spirit will be poured out. A prophet doesn't just predict the future. A prophet declares where God is headed. A prophet says, pay attention because this is the direction things are moving, whether or not it is the direction that any of us expected. The Spirit is moving towards the margins, always. The Spirit is being poured out beyond the boundaries of what is expected, beyond the people in power, beyond the ones who thought they had the whole thing figured out. And those who want to explain it away still have to stand in the middle of it. They don't get to set the agenda. They're just trying to silence the people asking the real question. Music is also a language. This week in Watertown, Wisconsin, a high school band director had his students spend the entire year learning a piece of music called A Mother of a Revolution. It was written by a gay and black composer named Omar Thomas, and the piece was dedicated to Marsha P. Johnson, a transgender woman who is a central figure in the Stonewall Uprising of 1969, one of the defining moments of the movements for LGBTQ plus equality. And 1 week before the spring concert, the school board voted to ban the piece. They called it indoctrination, even though there's not a single line of words in the piece. They said it violated their controversial issues policy. The students had spent all year learning it, and they were told that they couldn't perform it. So the community gathered. They packed a local church, Emmanuel Evangelical Lutheran Church in Watertown, which is an ELCA congregation. Standing room only, in fact, people were outside. The composer came himself and stood at the front and led the students in playing the piece that had been banned from their own school stage. The school board said they were filled with new wine. And the Spirit said, gather anyway, play anyway. The song will be heard. Music is a language. And for the young people in the band and for everyone who came and packed the church, the music was good news spoken in a language that reached them. The board tried to silence it, but the Spirit gathered a church full of people to hear it. And we see the Spirit here in Allison Hill all the time. And I need you to know that, because it would be easy in a week like this to lose sight of that. When we see a young woman finally stop making excuses about her addiction and agree to go into a recovery program, that's where we see it. Something shifts in that moment that is not willpower alone. Something breaks open. We see it at the dental clinic, when volunteer dentists use their skills to help someone who has lived in pain in their mouth for possibly months, pain that was quickly shaping how they ate, how they slept, and how they showed up in their life, and that pain begins to ease. We see it when people come here for a tour. They come in with ideas about what Allison Hill is. They hear the stories, they see the faces, they see this church and these clinics and these people, and they walk out in tears because what they thought they knew was shattered and something true sets in. We see it every Sunday in the sharing of the peace, when people who have been told in 100 ways that they're not welcome anywhere discover that this place is a place where they are welcomed as they are. That's the Spirit. It's not a metaphor, it's real. And here's the most important thing I want to say. The Spirit's action is not waiting on us. Look at Acts 2. The disciples didn't go out and find the Spirit. The Spirit came to them. The people in the streets didn't make this moment happen. God made it happen. The language is poured out, not because someone planned a beautiful multilingual worship service, but because the Spirit moved. We talk about having a choice, and we do. But let us be clear about what the choice is. The choice is not whether to create something new. The choice is how we respond to what God is already doing. The Spirit is already moving. The Spirit is already speaking in languages, already showing up at the margins, already gathering people who have been told that they don't belong, already breaking life into what looks dead. God's action is not on hold while we make up our minds. So we can respond the way the crowd did when they heard those languages and ask, what does this mean? We can open ourselves to the question. We can let it cost us something. We can ask what it means for us, for the community, for the arrangements of power and exclusion that shapes the world we live in. We can ask what it means for those who have been pushed aside and silenced. We can ask what it means for those doing the pushing because they're caught in something too. We can let the question lead us somewhere new. Or we can respond the other way the others did. We can see what's happening and take up a defensive posture, protect our comfort, protect our familiar ways of understanding who matters and who doesn't. We can see new wine and mean, don't ask me to change. Don't ask me to see. Don't ask me to follow the Spirit somewhere I don't want to go. But here's the thing about Pentecost. The Spirit cannot be unheard, and it cannot be unseen. The sound filled the house. The tongues of fire rested on each of them. The languages poured out into the streets of Jerusalem, and thousands of people could not pretend it wasn't happening. Even the ones who said they're drunk had to explain something. You don't explain something that isn't there. The Spirit is still moving. The Spirit is still speaking in languages people understand, still showing up at the margins, still gathering people who have been told they don't belong, still breathing life into what looks dead. A school board banned a song, and a Lutheran church filled up to hear it play anyway. A young woman said yes to recovery. A volunteer dentist picks up a drill. A visitor walks out of this church in tears because something they thought they knew just fell away. The Spirit is not waiting. The Spirit is not asking permission. The Spirit is pouring out on all flesh, on the people you would expect and the people you would not, on sons and daughters, on old and young, on the ones with power and the ones with none. And we are here, gathered together in the middle of it. Which means the question Pentecost puts to us is the same question it has always put to every generation that found itself in the middle of what God is doing. What does this mean? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for the world? The Spirit is already moving. Thanks be to God. Thank you again for listening to the Sermon Podcast. I'm always happy to have a conversation or pray with you. Please reach out either by email to pastor@christharrisburg.org or call me at 717-236-8382. I'd also invite you to be part of worship on Sunday mornings at 10:30 a.m. We're a very diverse, open, affirming, and laid-back congregation. Christ Lutheran Church is located at 124 South 13th Street in Harrisburg. Parking is along the street. You can enter the building through the side entrance on South 13th Street or at the corner of 13th and Thompson Streets. And lastly, check us out on the web. Our website is christharrisburg.org. There you can learn more about and offer your support for the congregation as well as the health ministries and free clinics that we provide to people in need in our neighborhood. I invite you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram also at Christ Lutheran Harrisburg. Thank you. I look forward to connecting with you, and I pray that you have a blessed week.